We should be going live in a little bit. We're live.
All right. Papa Day. Welcome to Independent Guåhan's General Assembly. We always start our General Assemblies by reciting the Inafresi together. So if you don't mind, please join us wherever you are as we recite the Inafresi. Okay, let's do. Inafresi. Ginanimas takilo, gihina soku, imas takalum, y corazonhu, Zanimas Naninasi who ofrecen Maisazu, Tarabai Pratehi, Zen who defendi, Ihinengi, Ikotura, Ilengwahi, Airi, Hanam, Zanikanu Samoru. Ni Iren Shakuri Retsu Ginenesu Tata. Esti Huafitma, Gihilui Biblia, Zani Banderahu, Ibanderan Guåhan. All right, Sisus Maasi. Wow, that was possibly the most awkward Inafresi I've ever done. these are trying times. We're still learning how to do the Inafresi online. But Sisus Maasi, if you did it along with us. Before we really dive into this assembly, we'd like to first introduce ourselves. So Guahusi Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero. I'm the co-chairperson for the Educational Development and Research Committee of Independent Guåhan, as well as the co-chair of the Independence Task Force. I'm really excited to be able to still do this. The General Assembly is an important part of our work, and so I'm happy that you're here today listening. Today I'm going to talk about our Maga'taotao Hurao, and so please stay tuned. Magat?
My name is Maga'låhi. I'm the co-chair along with Victoria for Independent Guåhan in general. And then I'm also the co-chair for the Media Committee of Independent Guåhan. And probably the constituencies today I'll be talking to you about the Fanohge March, 6 months in, and sort of what has happened and what needs to happen. Sort of to keep up the momentum in the decolonization.
Buenas and Hafade Toru Hamzo, and thank you all for joining us. I know a lot of us have been at home for the past few days, and so we thank you all for kind of tuning in and keeping up with Independent Guåhan. My name is Francine Napati. I'm co-chair of the Educational Development and Research Committee along with Victoria. And so we're here today to really talk about well, with every General Assembly, we tend to do a model nation. And so today I'll be talking about the independent nation of Tonga and kind of what they've been doing as we're going through this pandemic and as all of us are kind of prepping our islands and even our communities for a lot of the things that have been going on. So thank you for joining us.
Today, Guahusi Lawrence Azama. I'm the co-chair for the Media Committee and also currently the producer for Fanhita, and I'm here for technical support.
All right, Viva. So before we kind of get into today's topic, we wanted to first talk a little bit about who we are. So Independent Guåhan is a larger collective that supports the efforts of the Independence Task Force, which is a government task force that's part of the Commission on Decolonization. It was created by Guam's public law as the entity that educates our community about decolonization and our political status options. And so Independent Guåhan supports the Independence Task Force as a larger group of people who are engaging our community in multiple ways about independence. And so our mission is to empower the Chamoru people to reclaim our sovereignty as a nation. Inspired by the strength of our ancestors and with love for future generations, we educate and unify all who call our island home to build a sustainable and prosperous independent future. And so we carry out this mission in a variety of different ways. We engage our community in different types of educational discussions. The one consistent event we have every single month is that on the last Thursday of the month, typically from 6 to 7:30, we have what we call our General Assembly at the Chamoru village. Because our island is currently basically on shutdown, we decided to go online and to move the time up a little bit. And so we're still meeting on the last Thursday of the month, but today at 4. And, you know, the way that we see our General Assemblies is that this is like the one time a month that people can come and really check in about what we've been up to, but also really explore a different topic each month that connects to independence, or that helps us to see how independence is a solution for our community. In each General Assembly, we honor somebody in our history that connects to the topic that we're talking about. And we call them our Maga'taotao. Which is really like our community heroes. It's a phrase that was coined by one of our own personal Maga'taotao, Saina Ed Beneventi. And so we started doing that in honor of him. But, you know, also every month on top of the General Assembly, we do teach-ins. We have a podcast that is usually aired weekly called Fanatsu. And we actually just hit our 100th episode recently. We do artwork, outreach, so outreach through our art. We've done murals. We take our community on haleta hikes or heritage hikes to go and learn about our history, and much more. And so we hope that if you're tuning in for the first time to Independent Guåhan, that you know, we can sort of continue to have this conversation with you. And so we're attempting to keep the same format that we have for our monthly General Assemblies, and each one of us will do a different presentation today that connects to the topic, which is sort of looking at, you know, 6 months from the Fanohge March, where do we go from here, but also looking at what's happening in our community. How do we, you know, how do we see independence and decolonization as integral to moving forward as an island? And so the person that we wanted to honor today is Maga'låhi Hurao. So he will be our Maga'taotao. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his life and also what he's come to mean to our community today. And so this book here, History of the Mariana Islands, it was authored by a French Jesuit named Father Charles Le Guåhan in 1700. However, the editor of this book claims that Le Guåhan actually authored the book based on notes that were written by another Jesuit priest who had actually been in Guam with Pali Salvatores, named Father Luis C. Morales. And so this book, as well as other accounts written during that time of what was happening on Guam during the beginnings of the Jesuit mission on the island, sort of document or give us as much as we know about the life of Maga'låhi Hurao. One of the most important things to remember is that we're reading about his life from sources that are, you know, authored by Europeans who at the time were largely, and by priests themselves, who at the time were largely trying to explain or even justify their presence in the Marianas, the conflict in the Marianas. You know, at that time, Europe was very perplexed as to why, you know, people like Salvatores, who was an aristocrat, were getting killed and what was happening here. And so, you know, we have to remember that the point of view of the author is already, you know, skewed in its own way, right? The author has, you know, his own purpose, right? But despite that, I think that there's enough information about Hurao and the sources that we've been able to read from this time that tell us some very important things about who he was. So Maga'låhi Hurao was from Hagåtña, and he was very respected because he had really incredible oratorical skills. He was an amazing public speaker. And many of our ancestors were. We have an ancient tradition called Mari, in which people would spar back and forth with words. So like legends or great stories would be told in these like epic poems, like think the Odyssey or the Iliad style, where they'd, you know, different types of adventures would happen. And the person that could tell the story the best was very revered in the community, so much so that it increased their status. And so Hurao, because of his ability to use words to inspire other people, must have been incredibly respected. And so knowing that the role of the poet or the role of the public speaker during that time was so critical, Hurao was incredibly important at a very important moment in our history. And so he was baptized by Salvatore himself, but he was very skeptical, and he did it, you know, when you kind of read the sources, it's like you wonder whether or not he did that to also kind of figure out what was going on. And as time passed, he started to see that what the Spanish were doing was not acceptable for the community, but he didn't openly come out against them yet. What he did is he was like meeting with people, and essentially what we would call community organizing today is what Hurao was doing. He was meeting with people, seeing how people felt, kind of figuring out like, okay, this isn't right, but we have to be smart about how we respond. And so basically what happened is that he didn't openly come out yet against the Spanish, but then Salvatore had come to him and asked him to help them. He recognized that Hurao was so skilled, and he asked Hurao to actually help them. And Hurao said no, he wasn't going to help the Spanish, but he didn't yet come out against them. Well, this all changed when a young Spaniard named Peralta was killed, and the Spanish assumed that it was Chamorro people who had killed him. And so they arrested a group of people, claiming that they fit the description of the suspects. And when they arrested these people, the community was very upset. And so, you know, then Hurao came out and was like, this is wrong, right? So they arrested a bunch of people. And then as they were going around arresting people, the Spanish had tried to capture a group of people, and Maga'låhi, who was also very respected at that time, tried to stop them from capturing his friends, and he got murdered. And when he was killed, Hurao declared his opposition openly and began delivering speeches around the island. Now, it claims in all the sources that he delivered more than just one speech. However, we most famously know a speech that was penned in this book. And from this speech, the speech that now appears at the face of our museum comes from this original text. Now, I'd like to read the speech to you, but again, remind you that there are layers of interpretation that had to have occurred. So Hurao would have had to have delivered the speech in Chamorro, and then Morales took notes in Spanish, and then Legobian translated that into French, and then Coelho translated it into English for this publication that I'm reading from. So bearing in mind that Morales himself, or whoever actually heard any of Hurao's speeches, was likely not fluent entirely in Chamorro, they're going to apply to what they're hearing their own ideas of what they think the opposition is feeling, right? So Hurao may have said things differently in terms of the actual words he used, but the sentiment of what he conveyed, the power of his public speaking skills, was enough for people to resist the Spanish, right? To come out against the Spanish. And that's what we need to remember, because there are a lot of people that debate whether or not the speech is real. But they don't, and they can't debate whether or not Hurao is real, because he is an actual historical figure, a person that is written about widely enough that we know he's real, we know his skill set is real. But even if the words that are written in this book are not his exact words, the fact that a speech, and several speeches actually, were delivered in opposition to the Spanish became very important in the way history played out. And so I'm going to go ahead and read that speech, because actually in rereading the speech, like for the millionth time today, it hit me in a new way because of the pandemic that we are faced with. And I think you may see why. The Europeans would have done better to remain in their own land. We had no need of them to be happy. Satisfied with what our country provided us, we lived without desiring anything else. The knowledge that they had given us has only served to increase our necessities and excite our ambition. They think our nakedness is wrong, But if clothing were necessary, nature itself would have provided us with it. Why should we burden ourselves with clothes, a superfluous thing that limits the freedom of our arms and our legs, because they allege that we must cover our bodies? They treat us as a coarse people and regard us as savages. Must we believe them? Do we not see that under the pretext of instructing and civilizing us, what they do is corrupt us, that they have made us lose the primitive simplicity with which we lived, taking from us our liberty, which is dearer than life itself? They want to convince us that they bring us happiness, and many among us have been blind enough to believe them. They would believe them no longer if they realized that all our miseries and maladies appeared with the arrival of these foreigners who came to disturb our peace. Did we know any of these insects that cruelly pursue us before their arrival on these islands? Did we know mice, flies, mosquitoes, and all these other pests whose only purpose is to torment us? Those are the gifts that they have brought us in the floating houses in which they sail. Did we know rheumatism and colds? What diseases we had, we also had the means to cure them. But they have given us their ills without teaching us their remedies. Were iron and other bagatelles that they have brought, which have no intrinsic value, were they worth seeing ourselves surrounded by so many calamities? They reproach us our poverty, our ignorance, and our lack of industry. But if we are as poor as they say we are, what is it that they seek among us? Believe me, if they had no need for us, they would not expose themselves to so many perils or work so hard to settle in our midst. Why do they insist on subjecting us to their laws and customs, forcing us to abandon the precious gift of liberty that our parents bequeathed us? In sum, why give us sorrow in exchange of a good that we can only hope to enjoy after our death? They regard our histories as fables and fiction. Do we not have the same right to regard as equally fictitious what they teach us and preach as incontestable truths? They abuse our good faith and our simplicity. All of their arts are directed towards fooling us, and all of their science tends only to make us wretched. If we have ever been as ignorant and blind as they would have us believe, it was when we overlooked their pernicious desires until it was too late, and when we allowed them to settle among us. Let us not lose courage in the face of our many misfortunes. They are only a handful of men, and we can be rid of them easily. Even though we do not have those murderous weapons that spread terror and death all over, we can finish them off because we greatly outnumber them. We are stronger than we think, and we can soon free ourselves of these foreigners and regain our former freedom. So thank you for listening along. That's the version of Hurao's speech that appears in Ligobian's History of the Mariana Islands. After he delivered that speech and really started to rally people, the Spanish decided to arrest him for no real cause other than, igniting people, igniting conversation, sparking in people a desire to resist what was happening. And so when he was arrested, 2,000 people gathered arms and rose up against the Spanish on September 11th, 1670. And so a lot of the things that were happening then, we can see in contemporary, issues. Like, for example, when they were arresting people without reason, or when they were just killing people aimlessly, I really thought about like Black Lives Matter and how the whole community mobilized against people using excessive force or killing people for no reason other than you look like a suspect. Or in this case, when Hurao gets arrested and there is really no reason why, all of the people started to try these different means to try to get him out, and the Spanish wouldn't release him. And so eventually 2,000 people gathered and they said, enough is enough. You need to release our leader. And so there was an 8-day really intense battle that was ended because a typhoon hit the island. And then after that, people began to fight again, and then, still kind of feeling overwhelmed by the casualties that were happening in the typhoon. The people appealed to San Victorious, who appealed to the government, and they Hurao, thinking if we release him, he won't, he'll be good. People won't fight us. But in fact, as soon as Hurao got home, he began organizing people again. And the battle resumed for another 13 days. And at the end of it, this is the very first largest battle of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, and it had lasted a total of 40 days from September 11th to October 21st, 1970. From there on, there's various ways in which Chamorro people resisted the Spanish. Eventually, Hurao is invited to peace talks with the Spanish, and he shows up with another Maga'låhi agao and a blind elder, and gets murdered. He gets, in some sources it says he was stabbed in the back, another one said that he was shot in the back, but he was killed behind his back, which says a lot. And we've seen this throughout history where our greatest leaders, our greatest public speakers are taken from us, right? This happens in Guam, but it's happened all over the world. And sadly, that happened to Hurao. But his legacy has long outlived him. That's why we're talking about him today. Most notably, there's an immersion school that started in his honor, Hurao Incorporated, which began in 2004. And Sina Guinifi, or Anne-Marie Arceo, explains that she named the academy, which she founded after him, because of his enough is enough, attitude, and that was something that she felt we needed when thinking about how to keep our language alive. That enough is enough. If we don't start using our language, then we're going to lose it. And so I think that is an important way to kind of transition to the rest of this conversation, which is just like, Sina Arceo had felt that Hurao embodied this spirit of like, enough is enough. We cannot allow things to continue to happen the way that they're happening, is how we should be thinking about decolonization. Like, a lot of times when we talk about issues affecting our land, our natural resources, our community, it's like we point fingers all the time, right? So a good example is like, people coming out expressing, expressing resistance to the destruction of ancient burial sites and Lassie and Lusung because of the firing range. And then the response becomes, well, the private landowners have done this, or the hotels did this. And it's like, no, like, it's not about all these other people did it, so therefore it's okay for it to continue. That unless we as people don't decide a point where enough is enough, if we want to save something, we need to say enough is enough and protect it from anything that threatens it, then, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to keep throwing our hands up and placing blame until everything is gone. And so when, we were coming together in response to, the Dave Davis case and, losing our appeal in the case, our community had wanted to come together in the form of a march. And we had decided enough is enough. Like, we need to just make it very clear that we need to stand up, that self-determination matters to us. Chamorro self-determination matters to us. And originally we were thinking, Dr. Robert Underwood had this idea that, like, for us to really have political power in the eyes of the community, at least 10,000 people needed to be in the street. He calls it DS Smith. And we're like, okay, we're trying to plan a march in a month. Maybe 10,000 is not possible, but let's be inspired by our history. 2,000 people gathered for Hurao. And so if we could at least get 2,000 people in the streets, then, that would be huge, because that hasn't happened around this issue in our recent history. And so, I'm going to turn the screen over now to Dr. Maga'låhi Babakwa, who's going to talk about that march and what it meant.
Victoria, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And so the Fanohge March, September of last year, and as Victoria mentioned, part of the rationale for it was this Hurao story. And that this idea being that in the past, thousands of Chamorros gathered to sort of release Hurao, an inspirational figure, somebody that they looked up to. But today, gathering in hopes of seizing, taking back, namely sort of the conversation around decolonization, the rights of the Chamorro people, the ability to self-govern. And so with that in mind, this march took place, and Independent Guåhan took an important role in organizing this march, but it was not Independent Guåhan alone that organized it. There was support from all sorts of sectors in the community. All three political status task forces supported the march and sponsored the march. There was different community groups that supported it, different environmental groups, different nonprofits. So you had nonprofits like the Hadza Foundation showing up. You had different, you had the Eco Warrior show up. You had Tehi Lategzen show up. So you had all of these from across the community. You saw this interest in supporting this issue. But one of the most inspiring things, and I'm going to show a video, sort of a slideshow from some images from it. Some of the most exciting and inspiring things came simply from family, where a family that believed strongly in this came together and they made signs that said stuff like the Conceptions for Chamorro self-determination, or the Cruz family for decolonization, the Floreses for Guam's future. And so in addition to that, you also had different ethnic groups, other ethnic groups, non-Chamorro groups showing up. So you had a large group of Filipinos supporting Chamorro self-determination. It was very inspiring to see them. It was very inspiring to see them come out and make a statement showing their support. You also had smaller Micronesian groups showing up, Yapis, Chukis, supporting Guam's decolonization, Chamorro self-determination. And part of the rationale for all of this was to show that this is not a small issue. For those of us that strongly believe in the decolonization of Guam, it is something which connects to everything in our lives. It's something that influences the choices that we can make, the ways that we can develop this island, the ways that we can't protect this island because of us being a territory, a possession of another. And so we push this idea that as a community, all of us should know that and all of us should understand that. All of us have to basically realize that whether you like it or not, our political status affects everything from the prices of the goods on the shelves in stores, whether or not you can close your airport if you're worried about a virus and a pandemic around the island, in terms of what you can do with your land in order to protect it. So that our political status affects all of these things. But many people sometimes say that no one cares about it. They say that it doesn't really matter, and that they say that that it's just a couple quote unquote talking heads. I know that those talking heads. But so one thing that we wanted to show with this is that actually know that there is broad support in the community, broad interest in this issue. And one way that you can show that is that you can get more than 1,000 or 2,000 people into the streets on a holiday morning, and you don't offer them any food or any other reason to get out there except sort of their passion in something. And so this was a historic occasion. In terms of the movement for self-determination or decolonization, there had never been a gathering that was this large before. There had been smaller protests, smaller marches. In fact, Independent Guåhan had previously organized the Respect the Chamorro People rally, and at the high point we had maybe about 600 people gathered at Adelup, but nothing like this. And you could see it as people that dismissed it as just being a few people. All you had to do was look at one picture from the Guam Daily Post or any of the drone shots as the march was making its way from Adelup down to the district court. And that's clearly not just a handful of people. You had so many youth that came out. And that's one of the things that people shouldn't dismiss, is that if there are young people in a time when there's a good number in almost every community around the world, there's a good number of young people who think that what they want to do with their lives is they want to play video games or be social media influencers or be YouTubers. In a world like that, where in some countries that is the number 1, number 2, or number 3 goal for a youth, if you can get young people into the streets, passionate about something, passionate about protecting their community, passionate about their future, that's not something that you should dismiss. You shouldn't put it to the side and say, oh, it's just a couple of angry people or passionate people. That is exactly the type of passion that you need to improve this island. And so it was Bonito na Ha'ani. It was a beautiful day with so many people gathered out there, unified behind this idea that Chamorros deserve a chance to self-determine, and that the idea that Chamorros should be able to express what they want is an important first step in moving ahead in decolonization. That looking into the future of whatever we want for this island, the respecting the Chamorro place should be paramount. And so from the Fanohge March, we moved ahead. From the Fanohge March, 2,000 people gathered, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement. And soon afterwards, we had, sponsored by the Commission on Decolonization, we had the Fangita Conference. Is that showing? Is the slideshow for the Fangita Conference showing? Okay, so there's nothing. Just making sure. And so this was another sort of very important step in terms of moving into the future. The Fangita Conference brought people from more than a dozen different territories, indigenous groups, places that have recently decolonized, for a 2-day conference in which they shared their experiences about what they'd gone through in terms of achieving decolonization, and which they also shared about where they're at and the difficulties that they face now. And so hundreds of people sort of attended this, hearing about sort of the experiences of the Palauans. A former president of Palau, Johnson Tourbillon, came and shared his perspective. The Lieutenant Governor from the Virgin Islands, Lieutenant Governor Roche, came and shared his perspective on what they've done in the past to try to achieve self-determination, decolonization, and where they're at now. You also had Dr. Dan Enga from the American Samoa, Wilma Calaso Reveron from Puerto Rico, a human rights attorney, Mililani Trask, another international human rights attorney. So you had all of these people gathered, sort of sharing these stories, and it was important for us to gain this perspective, because too often nowadays, many people on Guam may feel that we are the only place left in the world that's talking about this, that we are the only place that sort of is thinking about decolonization. But in truth, if you look at what happened last year in Puerto Rico with the huge mobilization and the huge community uprising against the government there, to push out sort of renuncia Ricky. If you look at that, status is tied into that. If you look at Native Hawaiians, if you look at even Okinawans in Okinawa, if you look at people around the world, their status being stuck in a relationship, a colonial relationship or a neo-colonial relationship, is something that they're working to change. And so it was very important for us to hear from other places around the world which are experiencing similar problems, what they're doing, what their difficulties are, and so on. And so looking at sort of this was September of last year, and what has or has not happened since. And it is interesting because September was a huge month, very inspiring, but then it does make you wonder what has happened since. And that's where we sort of find a problem in terms of this movement for decolonization, is that for independent Guåhan, we continue, as Victoria mentioned, we continue to sort of educate, we continue to organize, we continue to get messages out there, we continue to share information. But what we saw last September at the conference and at the Fanohge March is that the community is clearly interested in it. The community, and when people say that people don't, that there's no one cares about decolonization, that's not true. That's not true. People absolutely care about decolonization. They absolutely care about political status. But as the late Ron Rivera said, if the leaders don't lead, then it falls on the people to lead. And the people lead, then the leaders will follow. We are in a situation where there is an interest in the community, but sort of the leadership on the island is still sort of unsure about how to move ahead, unsure of what to do next. But we can at least say that the infrastructure for education is in place, or at least the work has been started. And independent Guåhan is tied to a lot of that work. Independent Guåhan, we were essential in pushing the Commission on Decolonization to start talking about changing the curriculum in the public schools so that there would be an emphasis on our political status. That in high schools, for example, there would be more discussion about political status, plebiscites, and what happens next. Because if you can imagine that we are a colony or we are a territory, and you could go through your entire educational system and never talk about political status. That's insane. It's like, that's like trying to become a doctor without learning about illness. I mean, good luck. Trump University might give you a diploma or something like that. But so that's kind of where we're at now, is how can we, is that people are definitely interested in it. We can see it now. More than anything, if we saw the Fanohge March, if we saw the Fangita Conference, young people are hungry to learn more because they will inherit this island. And they don't have the same sort of experiences and the same sort of ways in which they're weighed down and the ways in which they feel they can't question things about our reality and our future. Because older people may feel we can't ask these questions because it's unpatriotic, it's disrespectful. Younger people may look and say, wait, why is it that Palau is protecting their resources but we aren't? Why is it that these other countries are doing it differently, but why don't we follow them? Why is it that we have to do it only this way? And so for younger people, there is this openness. But the question is, how can we get it to take advantage of that interest and that openness? How can we keep the conversation going? And one of the ways that we really, really need to do that is that when we face big issues, like we face nowadays with this coronavirus, this pandemic, there is this tendency that we feel maybe that we should pull away from talking about these things. That no, it's not the time, we got to buckle down. But when we really think about it, when things are difficult like this, when we're really looking at what are our options on the table, that's actually when political status is the most important. Because your political status will determine, for example, can I ask another country for help? If you are a territory, chances are good you can't ask for another country for any help. You are locked into whatever your colonizer, whatever the United States does, that's what you have to do too. If you're thinking about should we close the airports? If you're a territory, you don't control your airports. You don't control what comes in and out of the island. And so at a time like this, that's why thinking about how we can get this conversation going, the decolonization conversation will succeed so long as we continue to connect the issue of status and how we can be better to everyday things that affect us. Because we have to remember, what do 2,000 people in the streets mean for something on Guam, a small island like this? It means it's not small. It means it's not meaningless. It's not pointless. It's not just a handful of people. And at least 2,000 people recognized this to the point where they were willing to spend their holiday, Labor Day, going out into the streets to show the island and everyone else that it matters. And so how can we continue to do that? And so now I want to pass it on to sort of Francine, who can sort of look at our model country for the GA. So just Matsu.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Maga. So as we usually do with the General Assemblies, one thing that we like to do is we look at a model nation and kind of how they're handling something or how their structure is set up so that they're allowed to respond to things when their community needs it. And so everywhere in the world right now is being affected by COVID-19. A lot of people are in quite a panic. There's a lot of chaos going on throughout the globe. And so for the model nation for today's General Assembly, I chose to do Tonga. So Tonga is an independent country. They're one of the few places in the world that has a very limited colonial history. They were, however, pretty closely tied to Britain for quite a bit of time. They had a treaty with them in which Britain would control their foreign affairs, but it wasn't until 1970 that Tonga decided to rescind the treaty, and then it became a fully independent nation. And so the Kingdom of Tonga right now is run by its monarchy, And so Tonga is one of the few places in the world that doesn't have any confirmed cases of COVID-19 in its borders. And so Tonga is especially important because if we look at Tonga relative to Guam's size, we're fairly similar. So Guam is about 212 square miles. Tonga itself is spread across 289 square miles. So it's a pretty comparable model. Another thing that makes Tonga pretty successful in terms of its healthcare is that they have universal healthcare. Healthcare and medicine in their country is free. So people don't have to go and utilize other resources to get access to healthcare. They do, however, have private healthcare systems. However, their private healthcare systems are usually run by government employees who decide that they want to operate a clinic after hours. So they kind of do it in their spare time. Another interesting thing about Tonga is they actually have 4 hospitals. So that's double Guam's hospitals. Another problem with Guam is that unfortunately, the southern half of our island is pretty cut off in terms of access to healthcare. We don't have very many clinics there, aside from the Southern Community Health Center that's run by the Department of Public Health. We also don't have any hospitals there. I myself, I grew up in Talofofo for like the first 20 years of my life. And oftentimes when a relative would have to call an ambulance, unfortunately, it would take them quite a while to even find us in secondary roads because we lived all the way in Lucas. For any of you who are familiar with the streets of Talofofo, it can be quite confusing. So it would take them quite a while to even get to us. So Tonga, one great thing about them is because they're independent, as Magat was saying, when you're an independent nation, you don't necessarily have to ask people to do things before you can do them. So what Tonga decided to do is they decided that since they have no confirmed cases of COVID-19, they wanted to shut down their borders. They wanted to make sure that they weren't going to see an influx of cases because they had to handle travel coming in and out of the country. So what they did is starting March 23rd, and it'll extend until about April 6th, is they decided to stop any commercial flights coming with passengers into Tonga. So that also included Tongan citizens, but they gave them fair warning. They told them, before this thing gets instated, they gave them about 2 weeks to a month. They said, if you want to come back to Tonga, you have some time. However, once March 23rd comes around, the country is just going to get shut out for about 2 weeks, and you'll have to stay wherever you are. And they also, even before they declared their borders to shut, what they had done is they got very strict about entry into the country. So what they did is they told people that if you even want to come into Tonga, you're going to have to spend 14 days in self-quarantine in a country that's free of coronavirus. So you had to be very careful about where you even found yourself. So like, let's say if you were in China at the time, you would have probably had to make your way across to another country who wasn't. So this is, let's say, February. You would have to make yourself travel to a country neighboring China that doesn't have COVID-19, stay there for 14 days, and then you can enter Tonga. So they were being very strict about that. They also made sure to cut out any cruise ships coming in, any yachts that were trying to enter the country. They told them, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to dock, or you have to find your way to another country before you can even enter Tonga. And as of right now, it's now March 26th, so the entire country's sort of on lockdown. So I know we've been having this conversation in Guam about potentially shutting down our borders. However, we've had quite a bit of a challenge with that because we do have the FAA overseeing us. We have other federal agencies that have a say in whether or not Guam can shut down its borders. And we also don't control our borders. And so Guam, we haven't had the luxury of doing something like that. So what ends up happening then is that Tonga, they're quite fortunate. They can do that. They can tell everyone around them that their borders are going to be shut down. They can tell people that they can't travel into the country. And so one thing too that actually makes Tonga quite successful is that they're using this time for prevention. So they don't just want to shut down their borders to keep everyone safe, but they want to use this time to build their healthcare infrastructure. So as I said, they have 4 hospitals, they have clinics throughout their islands, but they also wanted to make sure that they were prepped in case whoever was in the country did start to become symptomatic. So what they decided to do then is they were going to start setting up testing sites. They were going to start making sure that all medical equipment was available and that their healthcare practitioners were ready in case the epidemic or the pandemic started to spread throughout the country. And that's one thing that's pretty important with Guam because we are a small island. So the risk of spread is quite high because it's a pretty dense, our population is about 160, 170,000. We're fairly dense. We like to see our families. It's really hard to kind of isolate ourselves in that way. And so what this allows Tonga to do then is it allows them to kind of keep everybody safe in that they don't have to worry about all of these external factors. They don't have to worry about new people coming in. They don't have to worry about people who may have been cleared getting into contact with the virus again. And so one thing that comes up a lot, especially when we talk about closing borders, is we talk about supplies. If we shut down our borders, does that mean that supplies are not going to make their way into a country? So Tonga thought about this. So they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to limit people coming into the country, but they weren't going to limit supplies. So they were going to have cargo aircrafts coming in that would supply the country with supplies that they would need. They also, as an independent nation, get access to funding. So they've been using that. I believe the World Bank's looking to allocate about 12 to 14 billion dollars throughout the Pacific Island countries. And as an independent nation, Tonga actually gets a slice of that pie. So they can use some of that money to prep themselves for COVID-19. And so really what Maget and Lola kind of illustrated is that Hurao's message and the Fanohge March, what that really tells us is that there's a clear dissatisfaction, and we've been dissatisfied with our political status for quite some time. And the real reason why there's this dissatisfaction sort of spreading around is that we just feel like we don't get to voice our concerns, or that our concerns are often not heard because of our political status. We're an unincorporated territory. We don't get much in way of voting power. We don't have much representation, especially in terms of the federal government. And so it's really up to US Congress and to even the president if they want to listen to Guam or if they feel that our concerns should be heard. And so the Fangita Conference was really this gathering of Pacific Island nations, of places throughout the world that have a shared colonial history, that have had to encounter administering powers, not necessarily listening to them. We've also got to meet with people who went through the process of decolonization. We got to meet with some countries that are now independent, but back in the 1980s, they weren't independent. And so this gave us a chance to kind of network with each other and to learn from each other. And so COVID-19 is that same opportunity. Everywhere in the world is in panic right now. This is a brand new virus. Humanity doesn't have much in the way of immunity with it. And so we're all kind of learning. You see countries who are doing well to flatten the curve. And so flatten the curve, right, is to prevent the spread. And so you don't want too many people getting sick at the same time because then it overwhelms your healthcare system. We saw when the government of Guam released some of its data, they were saying that if we keep going at the rate we're going, our healthcare system is going to start to get overwhelmed by next week. And that's really scary, especially since there's not much we can kind of do about it as an unincorporated territory. We can't just say, hey, our healthcare system's on the brink of disaster in about 2 days, we need to shut down. Like, we can't do that. We don't have the luxury of doing something like that. And so somewhere like Tonga, I mean, they get to do this in terms of prevention. They get to do it even before they get a confirmed case of COVID-19. They get to decide to shut down their borders without having to ask permission from another administering power, or to ask permission from, the United Nations or whoever it is. They get to control their own sort of immigration and also their airspace and things like that. So unfortunately, Guam, we don't get to do that. And so that's why things like political status are incredibly important because, as Maga'låhi was saying, it gives us a little more in terms of options. It lets us know what we can and cannot do. And as an unincorporated territory, we're quite limited in terms of what we can and cannot do.
All right, Cesar Masi, Francine. So I know that that was a lot of information, and I thank both Dr. Babakwa and Dr. Napati for everything that you shared. While we were presenting, I did notice a few questions come in on Facebook, and basically the rest of this General Assembly is going to be dedicated to you all. So we're really hoping that you can tune in, ask any questions you may have based on what we shared, or even just in general, with the idea of where do we go from here. And until you chime in with more, we're going to go ahead and address some of the questions that came in. One of the first ones was where to get this book. And yes, it is available online. History of the Mariana Islands is published by the University of Guam Press at the Micronesian Area Research Center. It's available on Amazon, on the UOG Triton bookstore, and then when things open back up, in all local bookstores. So we're still shipping them out on Amazon, so please definitely, it's a really interesting book because it not only presents the original text, but it also presents a lot of like footnotes and commentary on, what was happening and how it was received in Europe. So yeah, the next question that we got was, are there any laws in the Marianas protecting sacred land? We do have our own like preservation trust, and we have a preservation, we have a state historic preservation officer. And we do have some, of course, obviously we have some local preservation laws. I think one of the biggest obstacles for us is that, a third of the island is controlled by the federal government, and the military doesn't follow a lot of our preservation laws. So a very classic example of this is that for the construction of the live fire training range for the Marines, the military needed to basically level an entire limestone forest. And so they were going to they did destroy hundreds of really big ephet and lemai trees. Our local laws prevent, the tearing down of ephet and lemai trees, but the federal government didn't have to follow that. They still moved forward, and I believe tore down over 234 trees, if I'm not mistaken. But then also, in terms of the removal of cultural artifacts, a lot of that is supposed to be negotiated with the federal government and Guam State Historic Preservation Officer. But even the process to be able to, like, if we wanted to stop it, we don't have the mechanism to stop it. And we saw that when our local leaders, drafted a resolution calling on the halt of the construction of the firing range. Our governor wrote a letter calling on a halt to the construction because of the damage to these important sacred properties, and the military just continued forward. And so, again, it brings us back to political status, that we should, as a people, if you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we should have power to protect our historic and cultural properties and resources from any threat, our natural resources from any threat, because it is our livelihood, it is our survivability in our homelands. But currently, we actually have no ability to prevent the military from destroying our natural resources or historic properties. And so, as an independent nation, if we were to maintain a relationship with the United States, we would have to negotiate the ways in which our land is treated. We would be able to stop destruction if that is what our community wanted. But currently, we don't have that ability. Anyone else want to chime in?
It's true. So, for example, if you look at the U.S. bases in Japan, in Okinawa, for example, Okinawans don't get a great deal out of that, right? It occupies depending on how you slice it, 20%, 18, 20% of their lands are US military facilities or joint use facilities. But at least one of the things that Japan has, though, is that there's an agreement between the US and Japan, which was negotiated after World War II, so it's not a very fair agreement. But there's also a government-to-government relationship, which means then that if there's an issue, for example, that Okinawans feel that they should have greater access to their ancestral sites on the basis, the State Department between the countries negotiated and worked it out. Whereas here, if you look, for example, and so that's why on different days each year, families are allowed unfettered access to go on the bases, to clean grave sites, to pay respects, to leave offerings. But if you look at the Sumai families here on Guam, there's a Sumai day, right? And sometimes they're allowed to go on base, but it's a unilateral decision. The base commander gets to decide whether or not they can or cannot go. And similar things happened in the past over the Fena memorials that would happen, is that it wouldn't be Guam and the government of Guam or people on Guam and the US military coordinating or negotiating. It would be that we were allowed to go onto the base to engage in ancestral worship, funeral practices, sacred things, if the military allowed us to. And so that doesn't mean you have a say. It means that you get to do it if they allow you, and if not, too bad. And so that's the level of sovereignty you get as a territory, is that for 1/3 of your island, if they want to be transparent, they can. If they want to follow the rules, they can. But if they don't, then you don't have much power to really do anything about it.
I noticed another question from Tara Babauta, Hafide Tara. Is there already an international Pacifico Oceania governing bodies to voice this to the colonial USA government? Another really awful part of being an unincorporated territory is that we actually don't represent ourselves in international forums. And so that's why Guam doesn't have a seat in the United Nations. Without a seat in the United Nations, we can't be part of, groups like within the UN, like there's a group for small island developing states. We don't have, an embassy. We're not able to advocate for ourselves. Who represents us in international forums is the US State Department, which isn't even the department that, Guam, quote unquote, falls under. That's the Department of Interior. And so, the largest Oceania or Pacific body that meets regularly is the Pacific Islands Forum. Guam has an observer status. We don't have a voting status. We're represented by the United States there. And, an example that I classically use when I explain why it's very important for Guam to have its own regional representation and voice is that several years ago in a Pacific Islands Forum, Guam and the FSM were disputing whether or not the Marianas Trench belonged to Guam or to the FSM, claiming that Challenger Deep was closer to an island off of Yap than to an island off of Guam. And even the definition of whose EEZ mattered, or what, they were claiming that based on their EEZ that they were closer. And so the United States entered into an agreement giving the ownership of Challenger Deep, the deepest point of the Marianas Trench, to the FSM. But there are some on Guam that claim that an island off of Hurao was closer than this island off of Yap. But we didn't even have the ability to advocate for ourselves. And that is an incredibly important part of our identity. It's called the Marianas Trench. It belongs to the people of the Marianas, who are the Chamoru people. Historically, it's always been seen that way. And it's a natural resource. And, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, even basic human rights, entitle peoples to control their natural resources, because once you lose control of your natural resources, it'll impact your health, it'll impact your sustainability. And that's an integral part of our natural resources that was just given away, right? And even there have been reports of the U.S. doing testing in the Marianas Trench. What does that do? We don't understand fully the impacts of that on our health, on our environment. And so, yes, there are bodies in which, nations throughout the Pacific gather, but we don't have a seat at that table either. We don't have a seat at most of the tables in which we want to have voice. We are voiceless or represented by others who are representing their interests and not our own. When the United States goes to these meetings, they're not going to represent Guam. They're going to represent the interests of the US, which is largely military interests. And not the health and safety and well-being of the people who actually live here. It's more the health and safety and well-being of the people in the continental US. And so that is a very important question, and one that we regularly remind people that without voice in our region, in the nation, real genuine voice, right? Or in the world, Guam's political status again continues to limit our possibilities, but also to hinder our own health, well-being, and economic success. So I could go on for a long time about that, but does anyone else want to chime in? Oh, unmute yourself.
Okay. I can add a little bit more. So when you were mentioning, Victoria, when you were mentioning the State Department representing Guam, that's something that we really have to be very serious about. How much does anybody on Guam know about the State Department? And how much does the US State Department know about Guam? They don't have oversight over Guam. They don't have anything to do with Guam. And if you go to the US State Department and ask them about Guam, they will tell you to go talk to the Department of Interior. But whenever anything related to the US internationally that might be connected to Guam comes up, the State Department is supposed to represent us. But do they speak for us? Can they speak for us? Do they even care? And how are we inhibited and limited in that way? You just think about it like this. Think about it through Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know if anybody who's watching is a big fan of Leonardo DiCaprio, but think about it like this. A few years ago, you guys remember when Leonardo DiCaprio visited Guam? He went to the airport. And one of the guys there took a selfie with him and showed it to me once. But he came through Guam. He didn't leave the airport because Guam wasn't on his radar. Instead, he went to Palau and he spent time in Palau. And he went into the villages and he met with the people. He went down to the Rock Island, took a bunch of selfies with Palauans and he barbecued with them on the beach. Now we may feel, oh, Guam, we're so American. So Leo will like us because we're like him. But you know why Leonardo DiCaprio went to Palau and why he gave them a bunch of money and why he brought so much attention to them? It's because at international conferences on climate, on the environment, on the oceans, the State Department speaks for Guam, but Palau gets to speak for itself. And other islands around us get to speak for themselves. And these leaders, such as from the Marshall Islands, from Palau, and from other countries, have basically become minor sort of environmental stars in the world, where they're asked to go and travel and talk in other countries because of the great work that they're doing to protect what is their little part on the earth, protect their environment. And so we may think that because we are a territory of the United States, we are higher than everybody else in the Pacific. But the rest of the world doesn't see us that way because we don't have a voice to speak for ourselves. If we feel like we matter just because we're attached to the United States, it doesn't mean that we have any value to the world. Islands that are smaller than us, islands that we sometimes look down on because they don't have as many malls as we do, they are more well-known internationally than Guam is because they can use their voice to represent themselves. And so that's why this isn't an issue, it's abstract or it's just about you get this representation and blah, blah, blah. It has huge impact on how the world sees you and whether the world wants to help you, whether the world wants to visit you if you have a tourist economy and what they think about when they see you. So imagine this, people look at Guam and think of Guam as a trashy military base. They look at Palau and they think of Palau as one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And a lot of that has to do with being able to determine your own policies, being able to tell your own story. And so, but Sidus Masu for that question.
All right, so the next question was, does NAFTA not apply with us? Magat, you want to take that, or Fran?
Does NAFTA apply to Guam? I mean, so,
Yeah.
so Guam falls under the United States, so it doesn't really necessarily impact anything. There used to be a lot of, there used to be different ways. So it's hard off the top of my head, because it used to be quite distinct. But Guam had a lot of ways that it was sort of kept out of the U.S. in terms of economy. But what's happened over time is that slowly it's been brought in, and in a number of ways it happened to protect U.S. interests. So for those of you that are younger, for those of you that are older than me, because I don't, you may remember that there was strong pushes on Guam, some local, some off island, to create small industries on Guam. There was attempts, there was a beef industry that was attempted to be started. There was a watch factory, there was garment industries that were started. There was all these efforts to create local industries on the island to sort of make money here, keep money here, create jobs. What we saw usually though is that the US would eventually sort of use its sphere of influence to sort of crush those industries, because they would be seen as competing with US companies. And so it's one reason why Guam has developed the way that it has, is that there was a chance where we could have been outside of it, sort of similar in the way in which the CNMI once was and American Samoa is still. But the US, because we are more ambiguous, because there's no document that governs our connection to the United States, the US has that ability to pull us in and push us out, sort of at will. And so because of that, yeah, NAFTA, there was some discussion over whether the TPP, that it might affect Guam differently. Some of the negotiations did take place here when it was still operative, when the US was still involved. But that is one of those issues, is that Guam is within the United States in some ways, but because of that, it cannot benefit from being close to Asia in other ways. And so everyone here should be familiar with the Jones Act. And the Jones Act is one of the most basic, obvious ways in which are the advantage for us. So what the US gets from Guam is that it has a base, it has territory on the edge of Asia. The location is strategic for its interests. But our status denies Guam the ability to benefit from that strategic location as well. So we can't benefit from being close to all these Asian economies. We can only benefit if the US allows us to, but if it goes against that, we can't. And so thank you for the question on NAFTA.
Okay, so for another question we have from Chelu Ki, he's asking, what about dredging at Apra Harbor?
Sanam Asiki for that question. It's very important, actually. And another example, again, of the limitations of our political status is that when the draft environmental impact statement was released at the end of 2009, a major component of what the military's plans for the buildup were included the dredging of Apra Harbor. Massive amounts of coral and sea life would be destroyed to dredge Apra Harbor for carrier. And so two of the biggest issues the community was concerned about at that time, sorry, I keep touching my face, sorry people. I know it might be driving some of you crazy, but I've been in isolation, I'm good. But so the two concerns people had were the dredging of Apra Harbor and the use of Pocket for a firing range. Well, the community was able to file a lawsuit about Pocket. It led to the SEIS and led to the decision not to use Pocket, but now instead to use Northwest Field above the Texan, which is an ongoing community issue. But in terms of Apra Harbor, the response was that the military was going to continue to study the impacts of it. They were going to put out another report. And that never happened. We never saw that other report. That's the last we've heard from the military, but contracts have been awarded to companies to begin doing work in Apra Harbor related to the military buildup. And so a couple months ago, for one of Independent Guåhan's General Assemblies, our researcher Kyle Galindez had tried to contact this and find out, well, what happened? Like, are they dredging Apra Harbor? And we couldn't get information. We couldn't get information from our own buildup office. All we knew is that in the media it had been reported that there were contracts being awarded for Apra Harbor. And so this is really important. And it's something the community was very concerned about. And literally, it was almost like they thought, okay, it'll just go away, right? We just won't say anything about it. It'll go away. Nobody will pay attention anymore. And then we'll just do what we're going to do. Other things that have happened at Apra Harbor that the community should be concerned about is that they've been doing like live explosives underwater. They've been testing in Apra Harbor, and Senator Therese Terlahi has raised concerns about this. Community groups have raised concerns about this. It's one of those things where it's like we get this small notice, like, oh, be careful, there's going to be some live fire underwater testing, underwater explosives at Apra Harbor. And again, it's like, well, what does that mean, for our environment and for the sea life there? The military regularly puts out things like the draft environmental impact statement for the buildup. They do that for other things like what's some of us have followed is the MIT and the MERC, the Marianas Islands Training and Testing, or the Mariana Islands range complex, which is essentially the plans the military has, or not the plans, the ongoing testing the military does in the Marianas as a whole, is the largest testing and training range in the entire world in terms of sea space and airspace. And it includes bombing a nearby island, Farallon de Medellín, lots of underwater explosives, lots of use of sonar that has led to the beaching of whales and other kinds of takes. Takes are when your testing is literally going to kill the sea life that's already very endangered. And in their own studies about this, they list the number of animals that are going to be impacted. And this is something that Marianas wide, we should be working together to say, wait a minute, what does this mean for us? We should have a say in this. But again, because our governments are viewed separately, the military sees the whole Marianas as a jackpot in terms of testing. In fact, in articles about their big military exercises, you see military officials say, this is like a big playground. There's so much ocean and airspace. They literally talk about it like we're in a playground. We're just playing games here. But in reality, these explosives and noise pollution and Lord knows what they're doing and what they're dumping into our ocean and how it's impacting us, impacting the sea life that we consume. These are really important things that we, not only as a Guåhan government and community, but both the CNMI and Guam should be working together to say, hey, how do we feel about this? What do we think? How do we stop it? Is there a way to stop it? Do we want to stop it? Like we're not even having that conversation. And so it's a very classic divide and conquer scenario where we see ourselves as separate, but the military obviously still sees us as connected. And this leads to why, Earth Justice is suing, the Navy, because the Navy broke apart all the environmental impact statements for the buildup, where Guam was separate from the CNMI. And as a result, the environmental destruction, looking at only these individual projects, seems small. But when you put together all of these environmental impact statements and you see the massive destruction of our environment, it would violate all of the US's environmental protection laws. But they're doing what they're doing by separating it is not seeing it as a whole as being destructive. And Earth Justice claims that it's so destructive to the Marianas that the military should have considered other geographic locations to have their buildup at, but they never did. And therefore they violated NEPA, which mandates that they have 3 alternatives for their plans. And so I know this question came out of Apra Harbor, but all of it connects in the sense that when, valuable resources like our coral, our seabed, our fish, and, the food that we get from the ocean is threatened by military testing, one, we're not informed of the extent to which the testing is taking place. What are the environmental hazards? What are the threats to our health and well-being? But two, we have no recourse to stop it, right? And so even though the community was loudly against the dredging of Apra Harbor, to this day, we don't know for certain if they did it or not.
Okay, for the next question, we have another one from Tara Babalta. I'm currently state-bound and I've fought to represent the Chamoru people here in the States. I've given a speech to the local government here in Idaho on how states and voting people of the US could help free their fellow US citizens in the Marianas. Being 18, I find it unsatisfactory that I don't see any other youth fighting for this from what I've seen. Are there any ways that I could be able to work in co-partisan on helping voice these opinions in the state for change?
I mean, there's no youth on Guam or in Idaho that are. There's quite a few youth on Guam that are interested in these things, or at least that's what Instagram tells me. But so if you're talking about if you're talking about the states, you are running up against one of those issues that how do you talk to a country which has convinced itself that it's not a colonizer, that it has colonies? How do you talk to somebody who spends who spends so much time and energy and so much resources convincing themselves that they're the greatest in the world? How can you talk to them about needing to decolonize their colony? And so part of it is that it's simply a conversation that the US has refused to have for the longest time. It's really hard. And even when you can meet some headway, it's very, very difficult. I mean, we see it now. In a certain way, Donald Trump is a very ideal metaphor for the United States. It is lots of privilege. It is sort of not necessarily taking the best care of itself, always just kind of assuming that your privilege or your ability and so we see that with Donald Trump and the COVID-19 crisis, is he kind of just imagined that it was just going to go away because he says it's going to go away. And so part of this now is how do we talk to the United States about that? And I hate to say it, what I always tell people though, is that the most important thing is that you have to be strong and consistent. Because if you play the game where you are only talking about decolonization when something affects you, it's easy to ignore. So like, yeah, if, so that's what happens when Amazon won't ship something to you. Is suddenly, oh my goodness, we're such a colony, you know, or maybe the president won't get off the plane to visit you because you're the governor of the island when they pass through. Oh, suddenly you're so angry. But the issue though is that but then the rest of the time you talk about how we love America, how we're patriotic, how America is the greatest country in the world. If you mix your messages like that, you're never going to get anywhere because they'll choose to hear what they want and they won't hear the criticism and they'll never learn from that. And so I tell people, from the governor, from the speaker, from the senators, to all of us, put the political status of Guam at the center of how you represent yourself, that it is something that is there. And if you do that, then eventually the story will get out there. But if you always kind of mix it and say, we love America, everything's great and awesome, then when it comes time to you expressing that it's not awesome, they won't hear you. They won't hear you. So, okay. And so anyways, but that's some thoughts from me.
I just wanted to chime in that if you're finding it hard to mobilize the youth in Idaho around the issue, you know, you could really think about it in terms of engaging. Like some of the things that we do is we engage through art. So you can have, you can like get together and listen to like music and talk about it and connect it to Guam struggle. You can do like artist nights, or writing nights, or just thinking about what are some of the things the youth are into and how can you connect that back to, you know, teaching them about Guam, a place they may never have heard of. It'd be very different, though, if you are mobilizing Chamorro youth in Idaho, I think, than non-Chamorro youth in Idaho. And so if you are interested in mobilizing Chamorro youth in Idaho, some of us, when we were in college, we actually lived in different parts of the United States. Maga'låhi and I were both in California. Fran was in Hawaii, and we worked with other Chamorro people who were largely out there for school as well. And we started forming our own groups in which we would just get together and, you know, educate ourselves about what was happening back home, and, you know, coming up with ways to keep informing the large numbers of Chamorros in the communities that we were in about our history and issues that were impacting our community. So Maga'låhi and I were part of a group called Pamagsaysay in California. And then a lot of the members of that group moved home and have become really actively part of the movement today. And so what we do have is Independent Guåhan has chapters in different communities. So we have an Independent Guåhan Bay Area chapter, we have an Independent Guåhan Washington chapter, an Independent Guåhan Hawaii chapter. And so what it is that people who are not only interested in engaging Chamorros living in their communities around issues affecting our island, but very specifically engaging them around issues of colonization and the need for decolonization, will do their own gatherings there. So like the Bay Area chapter, for example, they did a gathering, or they were part of a gathering in which a famous local restaurant, Prebetsu, had cooked Chamorro food, and a lot of Chamorro people had come, and they did a presentation there, and they were engaging people with a table and giving out independence information, frequently asked questions, things like that. So if you are interested in starting an Independent Guåhan Idaho chapter, we would love to support you in that. We can email you educational resources to share with Chamorro youth around you. And that'd be really awesome to imagine. So thanks, Tara.
Okay, and we have another question. What exactly are the goals of decolonization?
So really with the goal of decolonization, one thing that we try to do is essentially what Independent Guåhan tries to do, is we're trying to educate the Guåhan community about what decolonization will look like. So each status option, so we have 3 or whenever we get to vote, so it'll be free association, statehood, and independence. And so each of these status options gets a task force. As Maga'låhi and Lola had said earlier in the General Assembly, both of them are the co-chairs of the Independence Task Force. And so money is allocated to the task forces to allow each of them to do kind of their own educational campaigns. The Commission on Decolonization itself is also committed to educating the Guam public about what decolonization, or even self-determination, as you might have heard it, will look like, and what each status option will look like under many different forms. We have a study that's coming up that's going to show different areas of Guåhan life in terms of education, healthcare, what things like international aid will look like, treaties with other countries will look like in each of these status options. So really what we're all trying to do, especially with decolonization, is really to change our political status. This is something that we've all seen and have struggled with here in Guam, is that as an unincorporated territory, the United States speaks for us, and they don't necessarily ask us how we feel about it as they would in the different statuses. They also don't usually consult us first, as we saw with like the North Korea threat. A lot of that was between the United States and North Korea. Guam was kind of just this middle ground in which all of these things were happening around us or to us. A lot of you might have been here at the time when that crisis was going on. We were getting all these different sort of flyers coming in the same way it's coming in now with COVID-19, where we were told that in the event of a nuclear threat or a fallout, we're to stay indoors. You're not to use things like, I believe it was shampoo or conditioner. I can't quite remember at the moment, but we were given all these guidelines as to what we can do, but no one was really talking to us or even talking to our government or our leaders about how Guam felt about that. we were also hearing about movements throughout the Pacific, like when even at the height of the military buildup, when Okinawa, when Okinawa is growing dissatisfied with the US military being in Okinawa, one of the first things the US decided to do, they were like, oh, well, Guam's just right there. They're not too far from Okinawa. Why don't we just move our troops? And, you know, Guam will just have to deal with it. We were facing a population increase. We were facing all these threats to our infrastructure and to our social economic status. And so all these different things were going on, but Guam wasn't necessarily asked. We weren't part of the negotiation. The US didn't come up to our leaders in Guam and say, hey, we're thinking of moving the Marines over from Okinawa. How do you guys feel about that? How do you think that will impact you? Do you think it's okay to move this number of troops, or would it be better if we kind of stagger it out? And so that's why we here in Guam had to really fight with the federal government and tell them that it's too much too soon. Like, all of this is happening, we don't get any say, and you're gonna end up taxing our infrastructure here unnecessarily by having this military movement. And so that's just a pattern of behavior that comes up a lot of the time because we're in an unincorporated territory. And so decolonization, really the goal of that is to change that status. Throughout the world, we've acknowledge the idea that a territory is not an acceptable status. We all have a right to self-determination. And so no country in the world should be a colony of another country. And so Guam, really with its decolonization efforts, is really just trying to get information out there and get the public ready for when the vote happens. So at that time, the Guam community can decide which of the three statuses will fit the community's needs and the community's wants.
Viva. So that was a perfect question to cap our first online GA. Sizos Maasi and Sino Maasi to all who tuned in, for everybody's questions. Also to our Kulut members who were also helping us by informing us of questions and ways to approach them. So while you may have only seen our four faces today, we have an entire group of people that were also joining in the conversation in many different forms. And so we appreciate all of you. We likely will have to do another online GA the last Thursday of April. And so we will see you here then, same time, same place. And maybe we can look into a topic about you know, regional solidarity, or look into some of these questions that you asked about really what does having a seat at these various tables give us, and that would be a really important thing to explore now more than ever. So I hope everybody is safe and healthy, and you know, we have many ways of continuing to connect, and we hope to see you all soon.